Welcome to the Universal Dancer podcast with your host Leslie Zare, author of The Alchemy of Dance and the Alchemia Remedies. Coming to you live from Cairo, Egypt, the ancient land of Chem. Journey with us to explore sacred dance, the sacred arts, the mystical and the magical. Join a community of like-minded souls seeking to understand the cosmic dance of co-creation through the sacred arts. Come along and expand your mind, ignite your creativity, and explore something new and something old. Welcome to the Universal Dancer podcast. I'm glad you could join us for this special roundtable discussion. This is a special event, and it will be live streaming on YouTube as well as my group on Facebook, which is the Universal Dancer community. So if you're interested in sacred dance, please join us there. Just put in the Alchemy of Dance community and you will find the page. Okay, so please like and share with your friends, anyone you think would be interested. I think we're going to have an interesting discussion. We have a lot of people who are experts in the field that are going to be talking to you about using dance for healing trauma. And I think this is an important subject which is come to the forefront at the moment. And I think that dance is a wonderful way to work with trauma. So we're going to get a lot of advice about how we can do that. So let's just jump right in. I want to begin by introducing you to my guests, and we will begin with Stefan. Stefan actually was the inspiration for having this conversation. Stefan is a globally acclaimed dance facilitator and choreographer. His book, Dancewise, and peer group projects offer movement and dance resources for transforming trauma. So thank you. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Leslie. Thanks so much for having me and for going with the theme that I suggested. I'm really pleased to have several of us putting our ideas and experience together.
Yes, I think it's going to be an important conversation. And we also have Rebecca. Rebecca Faro is a movement embodiment facilitator, a dancer, a poet, and performer with 30 years experience leading movement and self-inquiry courses in Spain and the UK. She also offers online courses covering different topics and individual sessions called movement maps. So welcome, Rebecca. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And we have Marylee. Some of you may remember Marylee from the Sacred Dance Summit. Marylee Hardenbergh has been a practicing dance movement therapist for over 4 decades. She works in hospital settings, private practice, and loves supervising dance therapists. So thank you, Marylee. Thank you for being here. It's nice to be with you again.
Thank you. I'm honored to be part of this group today and looking forward to it. Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Alia Thabit, is an Arab American Oriental belly dance artist, creativity coach, author, and somatic experiencing practitioner. Her work celebrates belly dance's ideals of feeling, playfulness, and joy with the intention to transmit these qualities to the world. Welcome, Alia. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm very excited. This is kind of a new topic for me, but one that since I've gotten involved in has become important in my life. And as I said, when Stefan suggested this, I just thought it was a wonderful, I would like to learn more. So I'm probably the least experienced of all of you in this particular area. So I'm here to learn as well. So I think we will just begin at the beginning. Let's talk about what trauma is. I think there's a people tend to think that trauma is something quite drastic, like someone being raped or soldiers coming back from war. But I think it's a much broader topic, and let's get into that, because I think we need to understand what it is and that it actually affects a lot of people, more than we may realize. So how would you describe trauma in your practices? How does it show up?
Shall I? Oh, please.
Marylee, why don't you begin?
Okay. I actually think that every human on the planet is traumatized because by the age of 5, because we all come onto the planet with a certain authentic self, and then that authentic self gets squished down. Like you must go along with these cultural norms. So I think in that way, everybody has trauma. Excuse me. And then, of course, what you were saying, if people have acute traumatic moments, that totally raises the bar of trauma. So I think there are different levels of trauma. And then, of course, there's the body or physiological level of trauma. Then there's emotional trauma. And then I think there's cognitive trauma also. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yes, and I think the way that our societies have come to raise children too has trauma's about not feeling safe. So I think that we need to think about this when we're just in general, as maybe we need to change the way that society is rearing children from the very beginning, because I agree with you that from the very beginning there is a lot of trauma. And I remember hearing an interview with Bessel van der Kolk, and he started by working with veterans in the VA hospital who had come back from wars. But he then started to work with childhood trauma, and the statistic was ridiculous. And I probably shouldn't mention this because I'm not sure exactly what it was, but it was staggering. It was something like there are 10 times more people suffering from childhood trauma than from like wartime trauma. And that was just amazing to me, that it's a much bigger problem in those areas. Actually, we always think of it in these extreme situations, but that there's actually a larger percentage of the population that are suffering from childhood trauma than from these other types of trauma.
Yes, and then in the psychological world, in addition to post-traumatic stress disorder, there's a new one called complex trauma disorder. And what that has to do with is just over and over growing up, they're just mini traumas. And as I said, it could be emotional or cognitive trauma too. But that complex PTSD is sort of new, but we can all understand that. So thank you.
Stefan, you want to address this?
I'm very much on the same page as you there, Marylee. And let me take a step back in a moment to see, because maybe the word trauma has different meanings for different people. But just before that, about the childhood thing, the younger we are when events happen, or when events don't happen that we hope would happen. For example, the comforting arms of a loving older person. The younger we are, the more it actually affects the way that our development goes. So in our very sort of deep neurology, wiring, brain, and even the way we feel in our body and our muscles are affected very, very much at a young age. And it's quite hard in a way as we get older to rewire it, but we can to some degree, which is the good news. But just to take a step back, if I may, everybody experiences difficulties and challenges. I mean, it's just built into life. And what makes an event traumatizing is that it feels overwhelming. The same event may traumatize one person and not so much another, because it's what we're left with afterwards. And the difficulty when it's overwhelming is that it affects us in such a deeply physical, embodied, neurological way that we don't know how to process it. So if we're lucky enough to have a great support group, like, let's say, a community that dances and sings together, or a very loving family, it may be more possible to kind of move through some of the feelings as we might move through a grief process and gradually emerge. But in many cases, there isn't very much understanding or support. And that's why I'm really pleased that we can talk about it now, to see what can we kind of understand and put in place to make it a more supportive world. Because as you said, Marylee, everybody experiences trauma one way or another. And if we look at the world news, there's a lot of collective trauma being felt, even just by people who are witnessing from a distance. Is very, very painful. So we need as much understanding and you might say love in action as possible at this time, I would say.
And I think you made an interesting point also about how different people respond to trauma. And again, from Bessel van der Kolk's book, this is a quote from his book: people who actively do something to deal with a disaster, rescuing loved ones or strangers, transporting people to a hospital, being part of a medical team, pitching tents or cooking meals, utilizing their stress hormones for their proper purpose, and therefore are at much lower risk of becoming traumatized. So I think that this is important to realize, that there's a certain amount of helplessness, or when we feel helpless. And I hope we can go deeper into this, talking about the different responses to trauma. You touched on it here, but let's go into it more deeply. Does anyone else want to respond to this before we? Yes, Alia.
Yes.
Okay. So I agree wholeheartedly with everything that Stefan and Marylee have said. And I would add that in a nutshell, trauma is a chronic dysregulation of the nervous system. And that happens when we are unable to or prevented from adequately defending ourselves in any kind of situation, from tiny to huge, that our nervous system and our body perceives as, a danger, a threat. And so when we want to, the body wants to defend itself and protect us, and when it is unable to do that, sometimes that impulse gets stuck and is never gets expressed, and causes like sand in the gears, and the nervous system never quite gets to reset back to its normal happy level. And when that happens over and over again, as Marylee talked about, chronic PTSD, CPTSD, it just sort of magnifies and magnifies itself.
And I think this again comes back to often what's socially acceptable, because a lot of times it's not socially acceptable to respond. You're not supposed to yell or scream, and children should be seen and not heard, or I can deal with this, or I'm going to power through this. And instead of that happening, you end up being traumatized by whatever the situation is. It can't express itself. And I think that is a very cultural thing, at least, and maybe people who are from different cultures can address this. But I see that here, yelling at people is, in Egypt I'm talking about, is socially acceptable. If somebody crosses your boundary, you yell at them. And I find this really difficult because I was not brought up that way. I was brought up to power through, to stay silent, which is toxic because at some point then you just explode. But I think that not that yelling or anger is a good thing, but anger needs to be expressed. If it could be expressed by just asserting yourself in some way, that's healthy. But I feel that I don't have the skills to assert myself, so it builds and builds, or I take it inward. So I think that in that case, it is a social, what the society considers acceptable. So I think that if we could, again, from the beginning, have better skills at how to deal with situations and not be in this children should be seen and not heard mentality, then I think there would be more outlets for releasing or not getting into this at all. Yeah, Rebecca, you had something to add to that.
Yeah, I was struck by what everybody said, and what Stefan said about the very early experiences, and especially the pre-verbal experiences, and lack of attachment. I know that when I always had an abandonment issue, for example, and I kind of worked backwards and found out that when I was 6 weeks old, I was taken to Singapore, and then I had a dysentery thing. So I was in hospital for another 6 weeks. So that was like my whole life again, you know. So I think these very early pre-verbal times when we're attached can be very damaging and traumatizing. Yeah.
Yes.
Stefan, you have something to
Well,
add.
yeah, I was enjoying going back a little bit to what you were saying, Leslie. I was enjoying what you were saying, and I think that there are many ways to let emotions out. And the great thing about expressive arts is that it's a way that do no harm, or we hope it does no harm. It's a very creative and kind of community-based, safe way of channeling emotion, so that we're not pushing it down, and we're also not. And the difficulty with free expression of anger is that when you're on the receiving end, you may respond even more angrily, and then it accelerates, and we end up thumping each other. But in a dance, I've never seen that happen. A great passion is expressed. There's stomping, there's leaping, there's a great discharge and catharsis of energy, if we want there to be, and there can be a very steady, holding, healing atmosphere at times as well. And it doesn't escalate into something else.
Would someone like to speak to, I think it would be important to talk about the actual sort of mechanism. Is there anyone who would like to speak to that? Like what, in the nervous system, what happens with trauma? Because I think that that's important for people to understand the actual physical pathways in the body, and how someone might become traumatized. Someone who doesn't think they're traumatized may have gone into these pathways and may be suffering and not realizing that it is a trauma response. Not that we should all label ourselves as traumatized, but maybe we need new language too, because I think the trauma does imply some big, well, it is big in the your system, but it can happen in small ways that can also be quite just change your life and how you process everything that happens to you. So would anyone like to kind of explain what happens when in the nervous system when we're faced with something?
I was just wondering if Alia might like to take that one, because the somatic training is so relevant to that.
I could do that, but I'm going to do it in a very general, non jargony kind of way.
Even better.
Right? So if your nervous system goes all through the body and connects to all these organs, and if you like Google nervous system, you'll see it's just everywhere. It's everywhere in your body. And there are recent developments have shown that there are multiple pathways of the nervous system. There's, I'm trying to make this simple and I'm ending up going complex. So there's basically two main branches, two main parts of the nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is like, it's the one that prepares for things to happen. And if you're in a threat situation and you would want to fight or flee, that's the sympathetic nervous system that prepares you for that. If you're a performer and you're going to go out and perform, the sympathetic nervous system revs up and prepares you for that. And it like makes everything, it charges everything up and makes you ready to go. The parasympathetic nervous system moderates the sympathetic nervous system and it calms you down. And it's, obviously that's also vital because you can't run around like that all the time. So something happens and it could be very, very tiny. It could be like, a shadow that you're little and it's a shadow and that's really scary. It could be that tiny, but something happens that, your body basically, not even necessarily your brain, perceives as a danger. And so, ideally you would, either engage with it socially and chat it up, or you would run or you would fight. But sometimes you can't because you're prevented from, or it's too scary, because trauma is things that are too much, too big, too fast. And so you might just be like, frozen. And sometimes we just kind of stay like that. Sometimes we can move, but sometimes things happen over and over and over again that push us into that state of freeze, because the third self-defensive action, well, the four if you count social engagement, and I do, but the classic three are fight, flight, and freeze. And freeze is the oldest one, like, bunnies freeze when there is any kind of threat. Normally, and any living animal, out in the wild is engaged in potential threat situations multiple times a day. Like, okay, okay. And like either you live or you die, right? You get eaten or you go on to nibble things yourself the next day. And the nervous system reacts and the threat goes away and the nervous system closes down. But when the threat doesn't go away and you're sort of like forced to stay in that state of uh-oh, and sometimes that happens again and again and again and again, and you don't get to express those various self-defensive tendencies, two things happen. One is that you're more likely to bypass fight and flight in the future and go directly to freeze. And the other is that your nervous system never quite, and freeze is the parasympathetic coming in to, like, if you have an engine in your car and you have your foot on the gas but the car isn't going anywhere because you have your foot on the brake too, it's like that. The sympathetic nervous system revs you up and then nothing's going to happen. And you're like, so the parasympathetic comes down and puts a lid on that and closes that down. And when lid doesn't get to come off and the sympathetic nervous system doesn't get to completely downregulate and settle, then you have that chronic little thing. And I've heard it described in many ways. I often think of it as a thorn, because if you have a thorn, it hurts and it's infected and it's a pain and it's awful. But you can talk about it all you like and it won't do anything. You have to take the thorn out in order to change things. And it's the same way with trauma, because it's located in the body in these little places where an impulse of self-defense got short-circuited and never got to be expressed. Does that answer your question, Leslie?
Yes, and that's kind of the point that I really wanted to make, is that this freeze pathway, I think, is the one that a lot of people don't know about. And so they just sort of and a lot of people do this, and I think it's so common, again, because in societies where you're not supposed to, where if it's not socially acceptable to express yourself, then you're probably just going to stop yourself. A lot of us just like step out, and kind of dissociate from the situation. And I think that that's a response that's so common that people don't relate to trauma. They just think that it is a learned behavior in a sense, or it happens. Well, it's not as much in your head probably as in your body, but it is something that, as you said, time after time after time, where you just repeat that behavior and that just becomes what happens. And I think people may see themselves as somebody who steps out, but don't necessarily know that that's where it comes from. And to me, that's unfortunate, because trauma is something that you can heal, and we'll get into that in a minute. So people who have those pathways should just, if they can realize that, oh, hang on, this is a pathway that's been created, but there is a way to get out of this. I'm not stuck with this for the rest of my life, or even to be able to identify it, that it actually came from some traumatic experience, like you said, that could have been something really small in their childhood that seemed really big, that this is something that can be overcome, and that we can learn new ways of dealing with things. But we can't do that if we don't recognize that there's a problem, or that it came from something, and that we need to build these new pathways in order to better respond to things in the future.
I wouldn't necessarily think about it like a neural pathway, as in, when we develop a new habit and we have to sort of lay down those neurons, and then that gets myelinated and we set it in place, as a survival strategy that we had to employ in order to survive. And that's the important thing, is that we survived and we're still alive. And because we're still alive, we have the capacity to renegotiate those things that happened in the past, which we may not even remember, because as Rebecca mentioned, things can happen before you have memory. People don't really have much memory until they're about 3 years old. And lots of things can happen before you're born, during birth, after birth, up to 3 years old, that, you're never going to remember, no matter how hard you try. But the residue and those effects are still there.
And also, if people are shamed, because as a child, if the parent then came and said, why are you afraid of that shadow? That's so silly. Why are you afraid of that shadow? Then you may your memory of the event may start to take on a different kind of the memory may be changed as far as what actually happened, because you don't want to think that, oh, I'm just a scared little child or whatever, and you don't remember the incident properly, just because you've kind of blocked it out of what actually did happen You block it out of
Yeah.
your mind because it's not something that you want to remember because of the response of someone around you.
True.
Stefan, you wanted to add to that?
I'd love to. Well, there are so many points that I'd love to, respond to, and I'm aware of time, but I very much liked the way that you explained it, Alia. It was very easy to follow. The idea of a rabbit that gets startled, but it comes through it, 10 minutes later is munching a lettuce. But when there's something that we would call traumatic, and if it happens to a human, very often we can't find the way back to the lettuce. We either get stuck in that numbness because we've closed down, or we get stuck in hypervigilance and we just can't switch off and sleep or relax or enjoy things. And just to put that in very everyday terms, there's a huge incidence today of depression, and sometimes related to that suicide, and very often among young people, sadly. And depression can be, it may not be, but it can be related to this feeling of being shut down, of somehow that in the process of surviving, as you say, we have to survive in the moment. The wisest thing that our body can do before we even think about it is to close down. But it's how do we get back from there? Or at the other end, if we talk about chronic being switched on, ready to flee or fight, it turns into chronic anxiety, which is another problem that we recognize, a much more everyday problem talked about than trauma. But very often I think there's a connection, especially when we look at collective trauma as well as individual events in our life. So that's why it's really weird that I love discussing trauma. It seems a little bit, I don't know, kind of odd to me. But on the other hand, I just love to create, well, to co-create clarity, so that, as you were saying, Leslie, so that we become able to support one another through each other's potentially traumatizing moments, so that we can become more like rabbits and get out of it again and hop about, which is where we want to be. There's always going to be stuff happening, but it's the resilience that we need.
And to realize that things that we know need to be cured or resolved could lead back to trauma. Gabor Mate's work with addiction. And again, from van der Kolk's book, he's quoting a research project, and I'm sorry, I don't know who did the research project, that he was calculating the cost, excess cost, or the cost of trauma, and specifically related to child abuse. He calculated that its overall costs exceed those of cancer or heart disease, and that eradicating child abuse in America would reduce the overall rate of depression by more than half, alcoholism by 2/3, and suicide, drug use, and domestic violence by 3/4. So I think it comes up in these places that people don't necessarily realize that it's related to trauma, but it is. We all know about depression or anxiety, and there we are trying to find coping mechanisms or medications or whatever to deal with the depression or the anxiety, but that's the symptom and that's not the cause. And it seems that trauma can be the root cause of so many things. So again, in a more holistic way, if we can go back to whatever the cause of it is, deal with that. And if it has become just the way that we're dealing with what happens in our life, so that we are re-traumatizing ourselves over and over again by going into freeze or whatever kind of mechanism we go into, then yeah, if we can get to the cause of what it is, if we can resolve that or at least become aware. I am not a trauma specialist at all. My interest in trauma came researching the book that I'm writing and on dance, and then I got into all these things with trauma. So I've been working on myself, and just by reading these books I've resolved so many things in my own life. So I think that we can live happier and fuller lives If you can make progress just from reading a book, imagine the progress you can make if you actually address these things and do some type of work on them specifically. So that's kind of what I, yes, Marylee.
I'm thinking right now about how the interweaving between trauma and shame is, and I love, well, Leslie, you brought up the word shame. I love this. It's a movement thing about, we have 3 reactions to shame, and maybe some of the panel have other thoughts about this, but one is we can go away. So we retreat. So we go away. The other is a sort of a cross, like we fight, like slap the person, in our minds. But the third one is we actually approach, and we try to appease that person. And then of course the overall antidote in my world for shame is contact and connection. And I think the same is true for trauma, like that there's something about whether it's connecting with and contact with other people, or having that contact with our inner observer to name what's going on. And so we have that internal contact. And then I just want to say that trauma is not a life sentence. So that's
no, not at all. And I think that that's what we're trying to do by having this conversation, is to, we'll talk a little bit more about how to use dance in healing trauma, but we need to first understand what that is, before we, just to realize, I think, how widespread it is. I suppose that's what was so shocking to me, is I just didn't realize how it was involved in so many things. I'm somebody who suffers from anxiety, and I had always been trying to find coping mechanisms for the anxiety, which dance was a very good one. It could be very grounding and discharging energy, but I always felt I wasn't getting, it wasn't deep enough. My understanding wasn't deep enough. But if I can then realize that this has all come from traumatic experiences, and I can actually go back to that and start to, take that apart, then that creates a much deeper kind of healing. So, yeah. Yes, Stefan.
What you were saying, Leslie, is it's one pathway which works very well for some people, which is to actually unravel the kind of the mysterious knot at the beginning of the story of, let's say, chronic anxiety. In my case, I could say some chronic pain, which I kind of thank, because it sent me on a journey, which has been a very good journey. But there's a great interest now in what's called embodied therapy, and dance is definitely part of embodied therapy, because as I think more than one person said, what happened that was let's say the greatest cause of how we are now might have happened at an age where we were too young to remember, or it might have happened at a later age, but because it was an overwhelming experience, our memory doesn't actually store it. The amygdala switches off because it's protecting us from a toxic memory. So the journey back to the memory of the cause may have a therapeutic value, and it may not. And embodied support, whereby we learn about the vagus nerve and the sort of master controllers of our own, you could say, wiring, the nerves, the brain, and all the glands that kind of fire us up. When we can start to dance with those, metaphorically and literally, we can loosen things up, because it's all a matter of unfreezing the thing that's become frozen, which in its healthier natural state would know how to restore itself. It's finding the path to restoring ourselves. So the story may be involved in that, but not necessarily. Tracking the story might even be re-traumatizing. A lot of work is to do with building up our resources and our flexibility and our response ability.
Well, for me, I don't know what the trauma was. that when I say going back, I mean going back to understanding the different pathways, and to realize that this dissociation, or these different, those I could recognize. And I think that that's why I want to explain this fully, because I think a lot of people would recognize those things within themselves, that they may dissociate, they may not respond to whatever's happening. And again, this is the point we're getting to, is that it is about this response. It is the ability to respond that is the healing part of it. But I could identify in myself that I wasn't responding. I don't know, and that I had created some kind of a behavior mechanism that was always taking me in a certain direction. So I agree, because yes, if you were to remember whatever it was, it could re-traumatize you. So I'm not suggesting that everybody go back and dig up whatever their original trauma was, but to be able to recognize that response or lack of response, and to be able to do things to reprogram on whatever level, so that you can become more fully alive, I think ultimately is is the place that it can and hopefully will take us to. Anyone else want to? Yes, Rebecca.
Yeah, and I think I agree with what you say. It's often when you move, especially if you've had a pre-verbal trauma, so that trauma doesn't really have words, but it has feelings, and it gets trapped in the body. So it might be that you can't even remember, or it's so, like Stefan said, so traumatizing that you don't remember. But you can locate it if you can locate it in your body by breathing into it and feeling it, turning towards it, I suppose, because so often I think with overwhelming feelings, yes, we turn away, we drink, we eat, we push it down, so the body, it's like that thing, the body doesn't lie, the body holds it all. So that's why it's so poignant and powerful to be able to give it expression through the body. Yeah.
Well, and let's go into that. I mean, that is kind of, I think we've set a good foundation here for understanding. Let's go into that. Most of you work in different modalities, so maybe you could explain a little bit about what you personally do, how you use dance to heal trauma, or things that you've done with your clients or yourself. Anyone who'd like to? Stefan, let's.
I'm happy to launch in, and I'm very interested to hear what other people say. It's great that we're coming at it from different angles with different resources. I've done a lot of dancing in circles, which are rooted in the very old village and tribal dances in societies where, in many cases, dancing is like we think of literacy. You would really hope that everybody would enjoy dance and would feel at home with it and would participate. It's not a competition, it's an inclusion. And when that's part of your regular activity, there's a lot of co-regulation. So during the ups and downs of life, and even major upheavals and very undesirable events, you've got that already built in as a practice that you come back to. We don't look at dance normally as a practice. We look at it as a enjoyment, or something that some people do because they look good. But in many older societies, it was the point where people came together, differences were put to one side, and you're literally physically holding each other in a circle and holding the kind of the group identity and all our feelings in that circle, not necessarily spoken in words, but by being present. So one aspect of the dances that I like to introduce is that container. It's a co-regulating container if you look at it in trauma terms, where we support one another. But there are other aspects which, as soon as you think of them, you think, of course. What happens if you stomp or shake? You're actually doing the things that animals do. If they've got shocked, they shake, or they sort of stomp it out, or they bolt for it. It's a very natural. It encourages our body's natural release to happen, because otherwise, if as you said, Leslie, earlier, we're educated to sit still and behave ourselves, and that doesn't give us an outlet for emotion. It might be a good place to learn mathematics, but we're not learning about emotional release. So almost every form of dance offers a form of emotional release, and the slower aspect of dance offers a kind of supported moving meditation, where the parasympathetic system, the healing system, is invited through the music and swaying movements and slightly sort of maybe hypnotic or trancy atmosphere. It's invited to, we are invited to feel safe and to come back into that space. So if we're not finding it naturally on our own, either dancing with others or on our own, but to meditative music with more swaying, gentler, slower movements is going to enable us to come back to that state. And I'll just add one more thing. I could go on forever, but I want to add one more thing because I find it so interesting. There are so many congruences in music. There are so many patterns. There's the pattern of the rhythm. There's the pattern, the melody creates, you might say, a story. There's the tones of the instruments and the different ways that they impact on our body. And as soon as we start moving, patterns occur, whether it's spontaneous dance or structured dance. There are complex geometries, far more complex than when we walk or go and pick up a cup of tea. So we're completely surrounded by coherences and patterns. And the stuckness and shut downness and anxiety that may be hanging around us as a result of whatever in the past, I would say it softens, because we're in this great ocean of possibility. We come back to an ocean of myriad possibilities. There's just a few like starting points of how dance can enable us to come back to our wholeness.
And I think in ancient cultures or in indigenous cultures, there would be regular dance events so that people would regularly shed some of that energy or be able to stamp it out. And when this is just a regular practice, I think that can be very healing for the whole community, just to have things like that, some kind of outlet to regularly, which again we can do individually. We can join a dance class or something, but I think in the past people did that. They on some level were aware that needed to happen, and it was just part of the culture. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead, Stefan.
Well, just a quick one, but being a multicultural urban, if you're in a multicultural urban community, the shape of that will be different. If we recreate it, it will need to have a kind of a different form that enables us to be much more diverse than we might have been in a traditional village.
Who else would like to share how they? Yes, Marylee.
Yes. So, so I come from the dance therapy field, and our training is very much uses the circle. Not always, but I'm just going to tell you about my early training. So you would go into a room and you would try to feel the atmosphere, what was going on. Then you would pick the music that you felt captured the feeling. And then you would invite people to come to gather into a circle. And then there's what one of my teachers called the gulping moment, where because we're trying to evoke a response. We're not trying to teach a pattern this was my early training. So the gulping moment was like, uh-oh, what are we going to do? So you look for little shadow moments, or you look if there's any moving going on, and if not, maybe you'd start with a very simple weight shift, and then just sort of see what emerges with a give and take. And then so there's an arc of the session, which is starting with a circle and sort of a warm up, and then a theme would emerge, and then at the end you have the calming down and coming back to the circle, maybe holding hands or touching each other. So touch is also an important part of our field. So we look for these moments of synchrony, which in the movement analysis world, they're when we just feel, we don't know why, but we just feel a sudden connection. And one way to explain synchrony is, have you ever been sitting next to somebody or driving in a car and you both at the same moment turn and start talking to each other? That's a moment of synchrony. And we can have moments of synchrony through rhythm or through space. And then this is a sidebar, but I love what a teacher of circle dance said, which in the ancient villages, when you go around in a circle, so maybe I start in the this position, and then halfway around I'm in the other position. So just through the miracle of working together in a circle, you learn some empathy. It's like, oh, this now I'm standing in this place, and I can understand a little bit better about that other place. So those are just a few of my words I wanted to say. Thank you.
And tell us a little bit about just what modalities you're using when you do this work. Are you using specific modalities, or I mean, in your dance therapy, or it's kind of just many things that have come together?
So in the sort of traditional, starting with the circle that I was explaining, which a lot of the pioneers of dance therapy used circles because, as Stefan was saying, it's just an ancient archetype where there isn't a leader. So the modality, can you say a little bit more about your question about modality?
Yes, I just wondered if it was coming from any specific type of dance or background, or whether you're learning. I don't know that much about dance therapy, so I'm not sure whether you as a therapist are collecting different pieces from different types of dance, or whether there are very specific ones that are geared towards healing that you are using, maybe not just to treat trauma, to treat many different things, but as a dance therapist, kind of those are the tools in your toolbox.
Okay, great. I understand your question. That's an excellent question. In our training, like I had to take lots of different dance classes because if I'm working with a client who has a certain movement repertoire, if I can't be with that person, that's the main thing. It's like the dance is communication. So when I'm the leader of a circle or session, I'm not necessarily using any particular modality. We all have to study movement analysis, and we learn developmental aspects of the body and neurological aspects of the body. But what my training was is I'm really looking what's happening with the people in my group. And so a lot of times there are movements that, nobody's ever necessarily done before, because we're just going with what's happening in the group. Now, having said that, there are certain things like a swing or coming toward and away from each other that everybody who does circle dancing knows. These are sort of archetypal things. But I would say, no, we're not doing this or that kind of dance. We're really trying to be in the moment and responding to what's going on. And oftentimes we pass leadership. So if I'm the leader in the beginning and I say, so just be with me as we're doing this movement, and then I'll pass it on to the person on my left. And you continue this movement until you're ready to start changing it. So that the sense of autonomy and having power and a sense of mastery in each of the people that we're working with, that begins to be seated.
Stefan, you wanted to add something to that?
I just wanted to kind of just to kind of add to that, or just to say, totally agree, because one of the things about any form of traumatic pattern that resides with us is there's a tendency to feel disempowered. We lose our confidence and connection. I think what you're talking about, Marylee, is coming in with a very open agenda, where in a way we're listening to the group and inviting them to find their own authentic expression through movement, and kind of mirroring it back to them and helping them to feel supported in it so that it might emerge further, which I think is a very empathy-based and lovely framework, because you're not coming in with you may have a bit of a backup plan, but you're coming in with a very open space to offer and to hold safely.
Thank you. Thank
for
you,
all
Stefan.
of you. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I just would say thank you, Stefan. I just felt very seen by you right now. So thank you. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if mainly you're working in groups or you're working with individuals.
So maybe everybody could answer that, but I'll just
Yeah.
say, so for in dance therapy, it's both. So I was describing a group setting. When I work with individuals, it just, again, as Stefan was referring to, it so depends on who the client is and what's going on with them. So sometimes I would just start with lying on the floor. So we sort of have three questions, which is what body? Who owns this body? What can this body do? So sometimes, depending on the level of trauma in the client, they just might need to lie down, face up, and breathe, and that I'm with them. And then maybe the next stage would be rolling, and then the next stage might be crawling, and then sitting. And so developmentally, we might need to recreate that. Other people come in and they're ready to stand up and move, and then we might work on increasing their movement repertoire, or their use of space around the body, because we believe that the more movement, the bigger your movement repertoire, the healthier your ego is. And the same with the amount of space you take up. If you just take up a little or a lot, that is also relating to a sense of self and mastery in the world. So I'd love to hear from other people.
Yeah. Rebecca, you wanted to say something. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I came originally from a classical dance background. And then at the age of 16, 17, I had a back injury. So that was a trauma in itself, because I had to stop. I was going into a kind of contemporary dance career. And so then I trained through an Anna Halprin method, that she uses a lot of creativity with her movement and art and movement and writing, and it was interesting because I noticed that it was more difficult for me to really get into my body because I'd had all this learnt movement of ballet and all this, than it was for someone coming up on the street that had never really maybe moved much before. So I had to do a lot of releasing of this learnt movement and this way of doing things. So And then I explored all sorts of other things, especially authentic movement and also rebirthing. So for me, the breath and authentic movement is very much about, usually do it with your eyes closed or with a blindfold on, so that you can really go within and move from the inside out. And the only instruction really is to follow your body, what your body wants to do. And it's amazing how revealing that is, and how the more you do it, I mean, I've done it before, 40 minutes with blindfold on and no music, because also, although I love to use music, music influences us. You get light, happy music or dark, and it makes your body want to move in certain ways. And so sometimes when I run groups, I don't do it straight away because people obviously find it a bit overwhelming. But as the week goes on or something, it's very interesting to move without sight and with no music. It can really take you to places and help you unravel internal issues. Yeah.
Like sensory deprivation to a certain extent, maybe.
Yeah, and just really finding your own inner rhythms and your own inner dance. Yeah. Marylee wants to say something.
Marylee, yes. Oh, you're muted.
Yes, I wanted to ask
There we go.
Rebecca. Thank you. I wanted to ask Rebecca about the role of the witness in the authentic movement, because I feel that's so important. And is that part of your authentic movement?
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Marylee. I forgot to mention the witness. Yeah, which, obviously you have a witness or to hold space for you, and also obviously you're blindfolded or your eyes are shut to keep you in a safe space. But they are also really, really focusing on you, and so it's a very held space and a very safe space. And then afterwards, often there's a particular way of sharing. Usually the mover shares first and expresses how that was for them, and then the witness just observes what they see, really. So they don't say anything, oh, you look so pretty. They don't put that sort of thing on. They just observe you were very small and your movements were very small, and then you shuddered, and it's amazing to get that feedback. And to really, because sometimes when you move you have no idea, you're so in it, you have no idea what's happening, if you like. So to get that reflection back is very powerful.
That's so beautiful, Rebecca. And I really feel that the external witness helps create an internal witness, which I think is so important. So as we're dancing and we're learning new dances, or we're with other people, we also have this, it's anchored into our own internal awareness. And I think it's so important having that external witness. And so when I'm moving with my eyes closed, I know I'm being seen, I know I'm safe, but also, what we say is, if you're a witness, you have an internal mover. And if you're a mover, you have an internal witness. And that really helps us create this internal awareness. Did that make sense, what I said?
Yeah, it's beautifully put. Yeah. Thank you, Marylee.
Alia, you do somatic experiencing, so maybe you can explain a little bit about what that is and how you use that.
Sure. I come from a belly dance background, Middle Eastern dance. I'm Arabic, and in my teens, I started taking belly dance classes because, I thought it would be a cool cultural activity. And indeed, that's continued to inform my interest in it over the years. And I started to relate to it, and I was actually trained in those early days. It was an improvisational dance. with a relatively modest movement vocabulary and a lot of live music. So it was really all about just like being able to respond to the music. Over time, I came in contact with Dunya McPherson's dance meditation. And she comes from a Sufi training, and many of the practices in dance meditation come directly from that lineage, including very, very slow movement, often coupled with rhythmic breath where you're breathing in time to the music, so connected to the music, but moving very slowly so that you don't even have to have an idea of what you're going to do. The movement is able to just evolve. And also connects to those cultural practices of improvisation and allowing the body to move as it wishes. So really you kind of get out of the driver's seat and let the body express itself as it feels to the music. In working through some things of my own, and I found that I was able to work through things through that process of slow movement and rhythmic breath, and I would go into it with intention, and the Sufi intention is connection to the divine. So, and the practice is introspective. So we turn our eye inward, where, in most dance training, you're looking at a mirror. We turn the eye inward and what is happening in my body, and really noticing and feeling the muscles and the tendons and enjoying the qualities of movement. So in realizing that I had some really large things that I didn't really want to try to tackle them so much on my own, and I finally became aware of somatic experiencing, which is traumahealing.org, if anyone is interested in that. And that changed my life. I read Peter Levine's book in an unspoken voice and had already been to some, trauma therapist and did some EMDR and some tapping and, okay. But I read that and was like, oh, wow, yes, that's it. This is it. Because that was that whole concept of, it's in the body and it just wants to get out. It's like, I love this. And loved it so much that over the next few years, I found therapists and did some of that work and entered the training and became a somatic experiencing practitioner, just because I found it to be so immensely helpful. Artists and dancers and really everybody tends to struggle with perfectionism and self-judgment and judgment of others and all kinds of things that I have found to be symptoms of unresolved trauma and fear of making a mistake, and all this stuff. And the dance, the belly dance and the somatic experiencing align very beautifully, because both of them are about noticing and allowing these sort of involuntary movements to express, where you're not planning the move. It's like, in somatic experiencing, a lot of what we do is, again, interoceptive, and we don't go deeply into like, and then what happened with bad experiences. We stay very far on the edge, as far on the edge as we can possibly get, and notice what happens in the body. What do you notice? Any kind of sensations that come up, any kind of images that come up. And as practitioners, we're like on the lookout for involuntary movements, like, oh, what is that? I wonder what would happen if you slow that down. And then you slow that down, and it's like, ugh. Because that's one of those self-defensive movements that did not get to be expressed, and it kind of has to happen on its own. It's the impulse comes on its own when there's a space for it to express itself. And so in the dance, in the same way, when you're moving slowly and when you're like engaged with the music and you're just allowing things to happen, things can have that opportunity to express themselves. anything else. I'm not sure. I think I got like the basics of your question with that.
Stefan, you wanted to add something.
Well, firstly, I'm so happy to learn this, Alia, because I've heard that term so many times. And I feel sort of intuitively drawn to the idea of somatic experiencing, but I haven't directly had, the training, and it's given me some sense of the potential of it. And if you think that so much of what we've been talking about is stuff that gets buried, that is somehow knotted inside for whatever reason. And we're talking about allowing the knots to free themselves, trusting the body's wisdom to lead the way, not necessarily having to understand the whole story. In fact, maybe keeping the story in a way that is a little bit safe and outside, but allowing the body to process what it's been stuck with. I really love that. And I was thinking that coming from my dance background has been a lot to do with structured dance, although I love teaching creative and expressive movement as well. Feeling for myself the need and the healing power of that circle, and actually moving as one body, moving together as one body in solidarity is very powerful to me. So within that very, you could say, a tight structure, how can we create the freedom, the authenticity, the safety for people, especially if they're not feeling immediately at home? So I just want to address that, because it's almost like the other side of the coin. The other way into dancing, if you like, is to come into a dance where people have a form. It might be a barn dance, it might be salsa, it might be what I'm doing, which is international folk dances and choreographed dances. So one thing that I'm going to reveal the source, which I don't always reveal to people, but I really want to. There's a wonderful woman who teaches voice called Frankie Armstrong. And when I went to a workshop with her in about 1980, she said, don't worry about what your note sounds like, because it's going to be a harmony somewhere in the world, whatever you sing. And I thought, I love that. That was liberating. So when I started teaching dances, I did an equivalent thing. I said, whatever steps you do while you're learning, it's a variation. And it might give me a great idea for another dance. And somebody added to that, it's an interpretation. So I don't mind, it's a variation or an interpretation, but it gives people freedom. And also, as the session begins, if I realize that as many of us are, that we might be dealing with our stuff, I want people to feel very free to come in or out of the structured movement, to take their space. And I make it clear to them that we consider that they're still participating. If they want to witness, if they want to close their eyes, if they want to leave the room for a while and come back, they are still participating. It's as free as a village festival would be. So I think that gives an expanded possibility for feeling free and relaxed and not trapped in a situation where you might go wrong. If variations occur, well, we've kind of said, don't worry, it's fine.
Yeah.
And I also like the idea of creating an inner oasis for ourselves through visualization, or perhaps through feeling our feet or breathing slowly. It's almost like a practice that we can carry with us into potentially stressful situations and become more bold and adventurous, because we know we've got that kind of oasis where we can come back and center ourselves. So that just was what was bouncing off me as you were speaking, Alia, and very, very glad for what you said.
And also this point of allowing yourself to step out. I think also we have to embrace the silence, that even in music, there are pauses. So there are times to be active and there are times to be silent. And again, to be aware of when those come up naturally and allow them to happen whenever they need to. Yes.
I just want to jump in again because it's one of the quirks of the circle dance network, or some people call it sacred circle dance, is that the guy who's generally attributed to be the sort of inspirer of it, is called Bernard Vosin, was very keen on that. He experienced the traditional folk dances as a kind of moving meditation, and for him, he didn't want the end of the dance necessarily to be an uproarious applause, but kind of digest the experience. Maybe it's a little bit like the sensory experience. It's like feel it in your body, feel the aftertaste of it, enjoy the afterglow before charging on to the next one. And kind of depending on the music and the atmosphere of the dance, it might be a very short silence or a longer one. It's whatever arises naturally.
To take it all in. Yes. We do have, go ahead, Alia. I'm going to go to some questions, but go ahead.
I'll just be really brief. In terms of your question about, freedom within the form, there is such many genres of, moving meditation. And I think a circle dance could certainly come into that context. And there are also many purposes of dance, and one of them is just social engagement. And social engagement is one of the things. Lack of social engagement and lack of a caring space is one of those things that drives trauma home. And being able to be in a safe space with people and moving, and people like folk dances because they feel so safe. You have a form, so you know what you're going to do, and you can relax into that form and enjoy being with the people. And that's what that's about. And it creates a beautiful resonant field, because when we're traumatized, we tend to be drawn always to focus on that negative. And being in a space, a warm, loving space with people doing something physical and enjoyment, is incredibly healing in and of itself.
Would somebody like to speak about co-regulation? Because I think this is an important concept. Marylee, go ahead.
I was just going to comment about the circle dance. Well, the folk dances specifically. Often there's a cross in the footwork. There's crossing over, so it's crossing the midline, and that's very helpful for the vagus nerve. So I wanted to say that. And then also, I love the idea of the slow and simple movements in a circle dance allow for more internal connection. So the quicker the movements are, the more we might tend to be thinking about the movement and am I doing it right? But the very simple repeating patterns allow us to increase this internal sense of awareness. And I love the inner oasis, Stefan, and it reminds me of what one of my spiritual teachers called the inner altar. So thank you.
Yeah, and allowing that variation in the movement helps too, where it's not really set, it's loose. That part makes a difference. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, and I think that whole idea of that balance between order and chaos, where there is some kind of a structure, but then there's freedom within that structure. If we look at something like ballet, where it's very structured and your goal is to look exactly like something, then that's kind of one extreme. Or the other extreme of just improv with that doesn't seem to have any has no initial structure. That can be very intimidating to people. But to have that midpoint where there are perhaps some types of steps, but within those steps, each individual is free to express in whatever way they want to, then that creates a support, or that feel not feeling like you have to maybe bare your soul by
Yeah.
being completely creative, but to be slightly creative and find that balance between the two.
Yes.
Stefan.
Oh, well, two things I wanted to respond about co-regulation, but I just want to respond to that one. My vision at the moment, and what's happening today seems to be part of this vision, is creating a resource pool, which consists of people, experiences, ideas, that give people a lot of options, because I think we're so individual in our tastes and our wiring and in our cultural, what we're familiar with and what not. It's really, for me, it seems it can only be a good thing to have a number of doorways and windows that people can enter and explore. And for some people, the pathway might be to come through very free, inner directed movement, and then increase the vocabulary of expression and movement. And for others, it's to learn some vocabulary and be held by a form, Cuban salsa or whatever, and then branch out from there and find more freedom of expression within it. I don't think we necessarily have to marry it all together in one circle, but to have a lot of a lot of colors in the rainbow of opportunities. But just to go back to your point about co-regulation, it's one of these buzzwords. Anyone that talks about trauma loves to say you've got to say co-regulation in every sentence, I think. But when we're very young, as infants, we know how to get excited. It's very natural to respond to stimuli and feel excited and engaged. But we don't really know how to calm down. And an external presence like the arms of a mother or the soothing voice of a caring person, and feeling nurtured in your environment, having the, being fed when you want to be fed. That's what enables us to learn how to calm down. So self-regulation isn't something that happens when we're very young. We benefit so much from having support externally, and that's co-regulation. And I don't think that child self ever leaves us. It's always part of us, and there's great healing, holding, comforting aspect from especially tactile connections with a person or a pet or um, and anything that gives our body a sense of being nurtured, which is one reason why we comfort eat, or most people love a hot bath, and all sorts of things give us that sensation of being comforted.
But I don't think that most people are aware. You said co-regulation is this buzzword. Well, it's true if you know what it is, but there's a lot of people that don't know what that is. They're unaware that our nervous systems actually regulate with other people that we're in close proximity to. And I think that people who work in the healing arts, for example, have always been aware of this. Mothers are aware of this, that when they're just near their child, the child calms down. So there are, in certain instances, where people maybe don't know what the word is, they see the effect, but then there are other people who are completely unaware that this actually is something, that it's not something woo-woo, that science is studying this and that it does actually happen. And I think that that's really important for people to realize that, especially as we move into a world of more technology. And I don't know, maybe it's possible to co-regulate over Zoom or over StreamYard. I
It
don't
is.
think so, but well, I'm sure it is to a certain extent, but I would be fascinated. I mean, if somebody would do because I know dancing with other people, you're able to align. So I've had that experience. And you do kind of feel connected when you see the other person or whatever. But I think that it's important for people to realize that this is an actual phenomenon that happens, and that contact with human beings, whether it is over Zoom or in person, is important. That we can't just look at our phones and expect that to be a substitute for for something, that for some kind of communication or interaction. It's not the same, and we need to I think we need to make that point, that this is part of how our nervous system operates.
We haven't
Marylee.
invented a hugger phone yet.
I'm sure that's coming though, Steph.
I don't know.
Yeah. There's a beautiful photo or video of Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. She's the founder of Body Mind Centering, and she's lying on her back. Her eyes are closed. She has an infant on her chest, and the caption is something like, "Soothing is not an internal reflex that we come onto the, that we're born with. It's something that we actually need to learn." So I just, when we're talking about co-regulating
Yes.
and how we need to learn that, it's there's a beautiful photo which I could try to send
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
No, that yeah, absolutely. And I'm a proponent of attachment style parenting, and I can tell you how much criticism myself and my children get with their children about it, because you're spoiling the child or what. No, this is just something that it's about our nervous system. It's so basic and so fundamental that it frightens me that people are not aware of that. So I think that's why I just wanted to make a point about it, because I think there are just a lot of people that don't know. They don't realize that this is how our bodies or our nervous systems work. Rebecca, you wanted to say something? Or am I making that up?
Yeah, just when you when you were speaking about your parenting, and your children's parenting, and it's so essential, I think, that attachment right at the beginning. And I remember when I had my first daughter in hospital, and I was holding her at night on my chest, and a woman, a nurse, came round with a torch and said, "Put that baby down." It was just impossible, and I discharged myself the next day. I was only 21, but I knew it was so instinctual that this is where the baby needs to be. Right, it's been right inside me. Now she needs to be right, and it's so important that, and how essential touch is, and we all need touch and hugs, and
Yes.
to connect with one another and feel community. And I think that's another great thing, about dance and dance groups, is that communal feeling is so valuable. Yeah.
Well, I think those of us who have been doing it always knew that, but now we have some scientific research to confirm or support what it is that many of us always felt. So I think let's take advantage of that, but it's important to bring that into the equation. Alia, did you want to say something? I thought I saw your hand.
Oh,
Stefan.
it was a while ago, but I can't remember what it was.
Okay, well, it may come back to you. Stefan, you wanted to
Yeah,
say something?
just to respond to what you just said, Leslie, I completely agree. I think intuitively, a lot of dance facilitators, song and music facilitators, physical therapists have been working to support, heal, and transform trauma for a long time, but without the vocabulary that other people would recognize and make sense, or without a vocabulary that links with neuroscience and what scientists are talking about. And there's a lot more rapprochement now, which I hope I got the right word there, but coming together of perceptions. And I find that very helpful, that in fact people who are very embedded in statistics and studies and neurology and brain science are coming around to saying the same things that we've always said, which is, or felt, that the body and the mind are not two separate things. They're intricately interrelated. And a lot of problems that we previously called mental mental problems or mental disturbances, our whole system partial shutdowns. And as somebody here said, I can't remember who, but it's not a life sentence, and there are ways of helping to unravel, helping to support, helping us to surf on the waves when they come. I do want to just add in something that we haven't quite mentioned, but I think it needs to be said. When people have had severe trauma, one of the challenges can be that when we get triggered, the body doesn't, the mind knows that this is not the most awful thing that could happen, but the body doesn't. It goes into a sort of a learned pattern, which you might call panic. It might be panic or it might be shut down. And it's very hard to talk yourself out of it. So when we're working with people who've experienced that intensity of trauma, the aim is to maximize understanding and freedom and support if someone does feel very strongly triggered, and for them not to feel bad about it, because it can happen and it may be very positive that things are coming through.
There was a question here about birth trauma. Does anyone want to address that? Do you have any thoughts on that? Alia?
I'm not sure the context of the question, but in the somatic experiencing model, the training model, birth trauma is one of those things, anything pre-birth, post-birth, birth, that whole area of time that is a thing. For example, maybe, your parent wasn't able to get to the wherever the birth was going to take place, and had to wait, and so that can be a challenge. There's all kinds of things that can happen, and those are things that we tend to not be able to remember because we don't have memory at that time. They also tend to result in a pattern of global high activation, which is, like a sort of edginess that doesn't settle down. But the beauty of the SE model is that you don't have to be able to remember it, because you take the symptoms that you're experiencing right now in the moment, and you just sort of work from there. For people who do experience that, kind of high level of activation all the time, one of the things you can do is just tune in to your hearing and past the sounds that are coming around you, and all the way to like that hum that's always there, that backdrop of like the sound of the universe, the hum. And then you just listen to that. And after a while, there'll be a little drop in that sound. You just keep listening. After a while, there'll be another little drop. And you go to three drops. And then notice what's different, because you will maybe feel just a little bit more settled. And trying to do that might be very activating in itself. Like, this is stupid. Blah, blah, blah. I'm just sitting here. And so you kind of have to persevere a little bit, and over time, that practice will little by little start to milk that high activation, one drop at a time, from the system. And you'll be able to slowly on your own start to come down one little step at a time. And that high activation comes from other things too, and it works for those other things too. But that is often a feature. That global high activation is often a feature of birth trauma. Whether or not someone was able to tell you about it, or because you can't remember it, you might not even know it happened. Nobody might have ever thought to tell you anything about it, but you might just have this quality of global high activation.
And I think that goes back to what we said earlier about that you don't necessarily have to, and maybe you don't want to, remember the trauma, but you can see the byproduct of whatever that is, and then begin to work, just because you believe that probably there is a trauma, and maybe it isn't better to remember it, but you can still work on it.
You just address this. The everybody has things. They're judgmental, they're perfectionists, they're anxious, they're angry. They feel like they have to control everything. Everybody has things, and you just address those things. And we start by creating, more of a container, so that we, like, the activation isn't quite so activating. We don't go rushing straight into what's the worst thing that ever happened in your life. Just start by noticing the body and being with it, and that all by itself starts to and then as you start to come into a place where you have a little bit more capacity, you can process maybe a little bit more activation. And little by little, one of my teachers, Lael Keen, uses a metaphor of a pot and cooking carrots. And if the pot is very, very tiny and it's full of carrots, they're not going to cook. But if you take even the tiniest pot and you take the tiniest little sliver of carrot, and you can cook a tiny little sliver of carrot pretty quickly, even in a tiny little pot. And every time you cook a little carrot, the pot magically gets a little bigger, and you could cook a little more carrot, but you just keep using the smallest possible piece. And we refer to that as titration. So we're always using the smallest possible piece of activation. And it's like a fractal, all these patterns. We've been talking about patterns. They're all like fractals, where the largest iteration and the smallest iteration are basically the same. So if you take the smallest iteration and you change something, you're actually making more profound changes in the bigger picture than it might seem.
That's beautiful. I never thought of it that way. Yes. Marylee.
So Alia, what you're saying is so beautiful for me on two levels. One is just the caveat that sometimes we'll do work and the client will just go, well, I didn't notice any difference. But just because they don't notice it right at the moment doesn't mean there aren't big changes going on. So
things happen over time for sure. Yes.
And the other thing that I like what you're saying about the just sort of taking time to feel. So that's what I've been saying about connecting, anchoring to an internal awareness is so important. So thank you for those points.
You're welcome. I would add, just as briefly as I can, that so much of the time in our culture, there's a lot of people's cultures probably who are going to see this, but generally speaking, in certainly the culture that I grew up in, and most people that I know grew up in, we are so encouraged to not deal with that. Oh, that hurts. I'm just going to go do this other thing first. My stomach kind of, and to push away every possible message from the body, and to basically be pretty pissed off at the body because, well, where were you when I needed help? Well, actually, the body was there when you needed that help, and it helped in the only way that it could. And it's still there, still trying to help, even though now as a grown-up, you don't necessarily need those same survival strategies that you desperately needed in the moment when those things happened. It's still, trotting out those same survival strategies and just hoping that someday the alarm bell will be turned off so we don't have to do that anymore. And you can just sort of start holding yourself in compassion, like, oh, honey, it's okay. You did good. Look, we're still here. And I'm here for you now. And it's going to be all right.
And I think that's important to mention, that whenever this happened, you were doing the best you could.
Yes.
Is to you were trying to cope, and you were doing the best that you could given whatever skills you had, which obviously as a small child maybe less skills than you would have as an adult. Yeah.
And you coped. I mean, here you are watching this.
Exactly.
If you're watching this, you coped.
You made it.
Can I riff with that?
Yes.
Alia, I love what you just said. And I think the thing is, not only are we inclined to not listen to the body when it gives us messages, but we're also inclined to either take painkillers or dull them down with alcohol or whatever. We want
do
the
calisthenics.
Symptom. Yeah, we want the symptom to go away rather than thinking, well, body, thank you, you're telling me something. Maybe you're trying to help me. But I want to say that in a therapy setting, we tend to think in terms of healing, supporting, or alleviating something that feels difficult. And in the framework that I like to think of, I like to think also of what's beyond the therapy, what's beyond the that supported situation. What's the fullness? Is there a way of transforming the thorn, which gives us an impetus to do something? It says go somewhere, do something. Something doesn't feel complete. To transform it into positive action that ends up expanding our life. And I've noticed so many of the therapists who I think are very inspiring and very compassionate have had a lot of intense trauma in their background. And I noticed in myself, I had an early infancy lack of handling, because I was born in a kibbutz at the time when they thought children were the children of the state. And anyway, the parents were very busy working most of the time. I look at a lot of people who inspire me and think, well, somehow in their journey, they've been fortunate enough to read the signs, be supported at the right time, find ways that really satisfy them, and in a way to make sense of that pain by transforming it into something that serves others, which is a kind of a long-term version of the story that you were, I think it was Alia, you were talking about. If in a disaster you can get involved in the disaster relief, then immediately that disempowerment becomes something else, and some of those feelings will move through. It's a kind of longer version of that, but I'm very interested in all the arrows that can point people towards expressive, pleasurable ways of being more in touch with yourself and others, and actually kind of almost make sense of that thorn and say, well, okay, it spurred me to go out of my comfort zone and live a bigger life.
Chiron, the wounded healer. Yes. We do have a question here about, do you feel we should have more dance in schools from a young age? Any thoughts about that? I definitely
bet we all
do.
agree with that. You said it. Not everyone has much space in their home or much encouragement from their parents, and children don't really need to learn how to dance. They can teach us. They know.
Yes.
They know. They've got their own movements. They imitate animal movements. And normally they seem, most children that I've met get huge pleasure from dance before they start to feel inhibited.
Yeah.
But I think this is a good thing to do with kids, is like, just, like I have playlists for my grandchildren. So have your little playlist of 5 songs or something, and when they come home from school, just put it on and let them run around the house. It's not a big, but that kind of goes back to that communal dance, as a cultural release, you can do that in your own home, is just to have, and like I said, just some playlists. So you don't have to think about it. You don't have to prepare it, but just have something that can, that you can play for the children, and they'll do their own thing. They don't need to be led into it.
And also, I think it can be when my kids were growing up, I for 5 years I taught creative dance for kids, and yeah, they are so creative, and I used to get them to listen to the music and draw, and I used to draw the story. It was always around a story that they kind of created themselves. And if they were angry, you know, they could just express it. It's just, yeah. And as Stefan says, I mean, I've got a granddaughter of 2, and you know, she's dancing like mad, you know, and it's there inside. Yeah, yeah. So yes to that.
I'm also thinking of the very vulnerable, tricky time of adolescence, and huge changes in who you are, how you connect with the world, and your internal chemistry and what you're interested in, and all sorts of things are going on, and anything that encourages expression and connection with other people, to me, is going to be hugely supportive.
I expect that's where street dancing came from. Like, you know, breakdancing and all of that was probably as an outlet to and they probably were adolescents or young adults that were doing that.
That's a very interesting thing also with people at that stage, especially having your own identity is so important. So it might be nice to learn some dancing from somebody else, but it might be more empowering to find your own your own groove.
Yes.
Well, on just this is Marylee, just a
Yeah.
shadow side. If we want to squish a culture, like we did in the United States, one of the things you do is you say you may not dance your own native dances. That's illegal. So it's anyway. I'm just saying, dance. Every culture has their own dance, and if you want to push down that culture, one thing to do is just prohibit the dance, and that's happened all over the world, I believe.
That's a big
And I'm
fundamentalist
sure,
push, for sure.
yes,
Sorry, go ahead.
and I'm sure that's a lot of what you know, why we stopped moving, that we were just not encouraged as a kind of a way to control, is just don't allow people to dance, don't allow people. It was, you know, take it out of the schools, don't make it something common. It's an art, it's over there somewhere. You don't want to be a dancer. All these messages that are sent out, you know, dancers don't survive.
There's a silly joke that from decades ago, but it was something about why do they frown on having intercourse standing up? It might lead to dancing.
Any parting thoughts? That I've kept you on here quite a long time, so any parting thoughts that anyone would like to share before we sign off? Just go ahead, Alia.
You can heal. You can heal. It is absolutely physically possible that, you know, and it might take time and it might take focus. And it, you know, one of the things I like about somatic experiencing is that it's actually a pretty pleasant model, and you can do it. You can feel so much better, and it can begin to happen very, very quickly. I used to hate myself. I like myself now.
And I think dance is a beautiful way to do. I mean, it's fun and creative, and why not? It's not some harsh medicine that you need to take and swallow down, but it is something that is actually fun to do. So definitely. Does anyone have any ways to maybe encourage people, any first steps that people might want to take? Okay,
You might
Stefan.
want to read. You might want to read my. Oh, where is it?
Yes, there it is.
Read my book, because there
Uh-huh.
are a lot of exercise. I can't find the right place.
There
A lot
it
of
is.
exercises in there at the chapter's end, which are very tailored to trauma support and moving through trauma. And I'm learning so much today. I realize that, there's a lot more resources out there, but this is one place to start.
There's always more. And that is Stefan's new project, is to create a
Nice.
resource
Yeah.
center. So we'll keep you in touch with him. But and also I interviewed Stefan, so I will link this to, I'll put that in the show notes, so that
Nice.
if you want to see that interview. Well, let me just then
I'd just like to say,
yes,
that
Rebecca.
dance is transformational, and just to keep on dancing, put some music on and start where you are. If you feel sad, angry, start with that and sit and just follow your body, and it's like an opening, and you will feel different afterwards. So yeah, just keep on dancing.
And I think most of our guests also have online options, so you can follow up with them. But let me just do that. Let me just give you some contacts for our guests. So Rebecca, her website is dancinginsideout.com. So you can. Do you have any up and coming events or online events?
Well, I do a full moon dance once a month. And that's not just dance, it's tuning in and dancing and sharing and writing. And I've got a course online that I'm co-running with a yoga person, Tara, in May, called Women Weaving Wisdom, about women getting into their more mature years, and expressing that and feeling empowered, and everything that goes with it.
Okay, so check out Rebecca's website and you can find out more about that. And Stefan, what about you? Do you have any up and coming events?
You betcha. It's so nice to dance with real people, huggable people. Saturday, March the 19th, we've got 2 bands coming. One is essentially a circle dance band, and one is essentially for free expression dance with a very Afro Latin influence and lots of big drums. That's in Ipswich in England, and in the same area we've got something called, on April the 23rd, we're doing a passion parade, which will be dance, music, and kind of rather exotic, funny version of a fashion parade. And in early May in Northampton, I'm doing a day, and at the end of May we've got a course. We've got 2 weeks in Greece, and there are actually spaces on the first week still, perhaps 3 or 4 spaces left. So contact me through the website if any of that sounds like fun. I'm doing a regular class on Thursday mornings in Ipswich, which is not circle dance, funnily enough. It's expressive movement, relaxation, with some live music.
And you can find Stefan at www.dancewise.net and www.worlddance.org if you want to get in touch with him.
And can I just add, there will soon be a new website, which is very much related to mental and emotional health, and with a special emphasis on trauma support and trauma transformation. So contact me if that interests you.
Excellent. Okay. And Marylee, do you have anything up and coming?
I do. It has to do with attunement, and it's so on February 2nd. So it was 2/2/2/2. We had a worldwide duet dance, all on Zoom, and a film is being. We had 90 film. We had 180 dancers, and 90 duet films. So that's been the final film. The final version is being created, and it will be up on my website, which is Global Site Performance. So it's sort of a sidebar to our trauma talk, but still, I feel like connecting with people around. So we had people on all 6 continents, many countries connecting. So I think that's very healing for our world.
That sounds beautiful. Yes. Okay. And yes, if you want to contact with Marylee, you'll go to globalsiteperformances.org. That's her website. And Alia, what about you? Do you have up and coming events? Oh, you're muted.
I do. Thank you. I have, some ongoing, most of what I do is online because I live out in the sticks. So I have ongoing belly dance classes. In April, I'm starting a class that is very much a combination of belly dance and SE principles. So it will have a lot of grounding and it'll have a lot of free expression. While we're pitching our books, this is mine.
Midnight at the Crossroads. Yes.
And it really goes very deeply into the jewel. I just am so impressed with belly dance. Like the deeper I get in it, the more I'm like, oh my gosh, because it really is quite astounding and talks about all of those connections between belly dance and trauma healing. And I am putting, so just come hang out. And I made a little thing. It isn't there yet, but it's aliathabit.com/ healing trauma with dance is the name of the page. And I'll put some home practice, like a little booklet of home practice options there for people who would like to start experimenting with that.
Excellent. We can put that. I'll put that in the show notes.
Thank you.
You can give me that. So yes, Alia's website is aliathabit.com. She's also on Instagram, Belly Dance Soul, and you can also find her on Facebook. Her name again, Alia Thabit. Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here. It was such a pleasure to talk to you and have this conversation. As I said, I'm kind of a beginner. You all have more experience, so I'm excited to learn from you and your experiences. So thank you. Thank you for being here. All right.
Such a lovely opportunity. I thought maybe with this number of people we'd just be skimming on the surface, and it was the opposite. I felt we really went deep and sort of informed each other. I really loved it.
I'm so happy to meet all of you too. This is really, really great.
Yes, it's wonderful. And thanks again, Leslie, for gathering us, and Stefan for your idea.
Yeah.
See, when people come together, great things happen.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. So as you can see, I'm losing my the light here. So I think it's time to end this. And before we go, I just want to tell you that the next guest will be Amara Pagano. She's the co-founder of One Dance Tribe and the creator of Path of Azul. And that will premiere on March 13th at 4 p.m. Universal Time. So thank you for being here, and your comments and your questions, and please share. If you found this an interesting conversation, please share it with your friends and let them know that it's here. And also, if you subscribe, you'll be notified when new videos come up. All right. So until next time, thank you. Bye-bye.